Megan Mullin, Associate Professor at the Nicholas School of the Environment and the Sanford School for Public Policy. Megan is one of the foremost scholars of politics and climate change and the environment, and her work has appeared in Nature, the American Journal of Political Science, and the Journal of Politics, among many others. She's also the author of Governing the Tap, which, despite how it might sound, is about water politics. It's not about fraternities. She is currently directing a collaborative project with Duke students and faculty from across a range of disciplines to digitally map North Carolina's water infrastructure for the very first time. Please join me in welcoming Megan Mullin.
Thank you, President Price, and thank you all for being here and inviting me to share some of my work. As you heard, I'm a political scientist, and I study American politics, and I sit in the environment school at Duke. And one of the most urgent questions in US environmental politics is why the federal government has been so slow to tackle the challenge of climate change. A problem that all available evidence tells us is real, is pressing, and is enormously consequential for American lives and prosperity. And some of my research has taken on this question and addressed it from the lens of people's personal experiences with climate change. I find that when I talk to the people who are most interested in climate policy action from the federal government, and these are scientists, activists, many politicians, and journalists, they have a model in their heads for how we in the United States are going to pressure the US government to enact major legislation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And that model begins with Americans' direct, personal, visible experiences with environmental harm. The model comes from events that transpired 50 years ago that led to the creation of our current environmental regulatory system. And at that time, people were having these direct personal experiences. We had the Cuyahoga River on fire again, calling attention to the contamination of the nation's rivers and streams. We had an oil spill off the coast of Santa Barbara, which prompted local residents to mobilize and call for an end to oil leases and greater environmental review of major projects. We had smoggy days in Boston and major cities throughout the United States, which brought people into public squares to demand a policy response. And this citizen activism culminated in the nation's first Earth Day, 50 years ago, 1970, when estimates are that 1 out of every 10 Americans participated in teach-ins, marches, protests to demand a policy response to environmental pollution. And this wasn't just a concentrated minority of Americans who were particularly interested in this issue. Polling data shows us that there was a really sharp increase in a very short period of time in mass public opinion about the problem of environmental pollution. And politicians were compelled to respond. It launched what scholars call the environmental decade, when we saw a whole series of major legislation enacted that addressed issues like air and water pollution, chemicals management, endangered species protection. These laws were enacted by Congress with large bipartisan majorities, and they were mostly signed into law by Republican presidents. So why haven't we seen this same kind of politics feeding a response to climate change? In a series of papers that I've carried out with a collaborator, I've looked at this question through the lens, as I said, of Americans' personal experiences with climate change. And what we have found is that climate change simply isn't going to be the kind of catalyst to mobilize Americans' responses. And the personal experiences that we focus on with respect to climate change focus on local weather. For a long time, Americans understood climate change impacts in two ways. It melted glaciers somewhere far away, and it warmed temperatures, global warming. And so we wanted to know, how do people respond to warmer temperatures? And so in our first study, we took data from Pew Research, publicly available data. And Pew Research is a polling organization that regularly asks nationally representative samples of Americans about their climate attitudes and beliefs. And we took 5 surveys conducted at different points in time. We geolocated the respondents to those surveys, and we compiled local weather data to see what weather these people had been exposed to right before they responded to the survey. We wanted to know whether people who had been exposed to warmer than normal temperatures for their community at that time of year, whether they would be more likely to say that they believed the evidence that the planet was warming. And sure enough, it was true. Warmer temperatures increased climate belief, especially among those people who typically don't spend a lot of time thinking about politics. But the effects didn't persist. Even people who had been exposed to a sustained heat wave, right, with dramatic temperature increases for a sustained period of time, that increased belief pretty sharply among those people, but the effect didn't last. It disappeared after a few weeks. This personal experience seemed not to have a lasting effect on people's opinions. So then we started to wonder, what are the cumulative experiences with weather that Americans have had over the decades when they've been hearing about this problem? As scientists and some politicians have been trying to convince us that there's a climate crisis, is it possible that some Americans are thinking, it's not so bad? Is it even possible that for some Americans, things were improving? Quite simply, was the weather becoming more pleasant? And so that, of course, required us to define what's pleasant weather. And we could lean on some existing literature there. And so it turns out that the average American has a revealed preference for weather conditions. What we like is warm winters and mild, less humid summers. And so again, we went to these, weather station data. We compiled 40 years of daily weather data for locations throughout the United States. We pulled the data together. We weighted it by population because we were interested in what people were exposed to. And we showed that the vast majority of Americans live in places where the weather conditions have improved. We're enjoying warmer winters, and we're not paying the price with hotter summers, at least not yet. And so the punchline of this research is we can't count on people's personal experiences to motivate this kind of concern and this kind of political change. Our personal experiences with climate change are misleading about the nature and the severity of the problem. And even when they do affect our attitudes, those attitude changes don't seem to persist. Now, you all are sitting here in Miami, and you might be thinking of you're experiencing climate change, I hear, right? You have flooding on sunny days, chronic flooding. You're experiencing increasingly severe storms. You might be listening to me and thinking, these little temperature changes are not the climate change impacts that we're worried about. And you're right, and I'm glad you're thinking that if you are. And more Americans are sharing that perception. More and more Americans are understanding the severe climate change impacts that are unfolding. But the preliminary research suggests that, in fact, the effects on attitudes aren't really any different. That even experiencing an extreme weather event has a short-term, effect on attitudes, but it doesn't in any lasting way change our perceptions of the underlying problem. So what is shaping those perceptions of the underlying problem? I could probably ask you all, and you'd give me the right answer. It's polarization. It's partisanship. Just like everywhere else in American politics, the way we understand climate change is through the lens of our partisan affiliation. And in fact, the partisan divide on climate change is as big or bigger than on any other issue in American politics. And that gap isn't closing. In fact, I have new research that shows that as climate change is occupying more attention from environmental groups and the media, it's driving a wedge in opinion about environmental issues that historically united us. Things like our care for wildlife and drinking water protection. So does all this mean that it's hopeless and the federal government will never act on climate change? No, I don't want you to walk away with that idea. There are other models for policy change than the model, this dominant model that I've described. Policy change doesn't just come about from bottom-up public mobilization. There are other models that can produce it. But as I sit in an environment school, right, it's important that I can train my students and help talk to my colleagues to help them understand that not all Americans share their preoccupation with this issue. For most Americans, science or even their own personal experiences aren't going to be enough to propel them to support some policy that their political party opposes. Understanding environmental change requires that we understand the political context for that change and the political structures, and that's what I bring to Duke, and that's what I bring to the environment. And thank you very much.
So once again, now that you know the drill, we have the floor open for questions, and I see a hand waving right here.
There is a hand.
Hi, I'm Hank Lemieux. I was actually poli-sci class of '87. I'm really gratified to hear that you've identified partisanship at the core of this. I say that because that's actually the exact problem that I'm working on with my life right now. And if any of you guys want to see what's happening, you can go to e.pluribus.us, e.pluribus.us. But what I was going to ask you about is, and this is what I'm working on, if you come to the conclusion, particularly as a political scientist, that the underlying problem here is not actually ecological or scientific, it's partisanship, then where has this led you and what do you do next?
I teach. I have to say that a lot of this research has really mobilized my teaching because I work in this environment school where I'm the political scientist, right, one of only a couple, and I'm training students who are going to go out and work in the sciences mostly, right? And they're going to be, in many cases, resource managers, in many cases working with local governments, in many cases working with sort of NGOs and companies. And this hasn't been my background, but I've become more and more interested and enthusiastic about science communication and the way that scientists communicate with the public. Right? Because for a long time, there was sort of an idea among scientists that if everybody just knew, right, then we would change things. And we know now, I'm seeing you shake I can't see anything out there except you shaking your head. And so we know now that that's not the case. And so thinking about how we build communication skills that allow us to communicate across barriers and allow us to find sort of common interests with one another. And some of these are really tough nuts to crack, especially at the national level. But there are lots of opportunities to build coalitions and work in community at the local level, and very often without using the language that polarizes us.
We have a question over on this side.
Hi, thank you. At the end, you mentioned there were other models of policy change that we could pursue other than the dominant one. What are the most promising in this field?
Well, there are interest group models, right, where interest groups navigate with one another. There are elite-driven models, right? So we have had historically really substantial major policy changes that come about because political leaders recognize a problem and work in coalition to tackle it, right? So one that I point to frequently when I talk about these things is, tax reform in the mid-1980s, right? There wasn't this clamor at the mass public level for tax reform, but political leaders in Washington took this on and really had to navigate a lot of complicated interest group politics to get it done. Another one that I actually think is really important in this case is what we call in political science distributive politics, right? The fact that politicians really want to be able to deliver the goods for their geographic constituencies. And so we can think about modeling policies that allow politicians to do that and to build geographic bases of support for different types of policy change. And those also can kind of happen through more elite and political party negotiation rather than kind of bottom-up mass mobilization.
Yeah. I think another example might be seatbelt use, for example. It's not as though there was any groundswell of public support. In fact, there was unhappiness with it, but it was persistently pursued for a variety of reasons and now accepted more or less as standard operating procedure in many respects.
That's right.
Yes, Laura. Microphone is coming.
Megan, thank you so much. Why do you do this work at Duke? And are there cohorts out there in other communities, other campus communities, other universities that come together around this? Is there a groundswell within a university community that makes this happen? And again, why do you do this at Duke?
That's a great question. Thank you for asking that. As Charlie was talking, I was thinking, I didn't include enough of that in my talk. I do this at Duke because there are so many different lenses into this problem that are represented around the campus. And then, most importantly, so many opportunities on the campus for those different lenses to be brought together. Many scholars, many universities talk about interdisciplinarity, right? And they pitch a good, nice talk about it. Duke walks the walk about interdisciplinarity, right? So one of the projects that I'm involved in that doesn't have to do with this public opinion piece, but more has to do with how local communities, coastal communities in North Carolina are thinking long-term about how to adapt and how to change over time to sea level rise and coastal storms. I'm working with geophysicists, I'm working with economists, I'm working with biologists, right? I'm working with a whole team of different scholars from different disciplines in order to be able to think in really long-term time horizons about how some of these communities are going to change. And there are so many, not just the bodies available to do it, but an infrastructure at Duke within the Nicholas School, but campus-wide, that enables that kind of collaboration.
Perhaps time for one more question. We have a question here.
When you started your presentation, the first thing that came to my mind was the scandal at Flint, Michigan, the water crisis. How are you thinking about this? We haven't heard anything after the scandal. I mean, do you focus your research on cases like that that actually came about to be nationally advertised or nationally known, and then we don't hear anything about it anymore? It's been documented of the many lives that were impacted by that national crisis. So can you explain to us what happened after that?
I don't think I can give, you can sign up for my courses because, you know, in another research hat that I wear, I think a lot about how we govern local water resources, and I think a lot about environmental justice, and I think a lot about how public services get distributed across communities, and the long history of racism and injustice that has fed ill distributions of public services across communities, and then the ramifications of that in the present day. And so the Flint crisis brings together so many challenges around the political incentives that are in place, right, for elected politicians and for bureaucrats, the long legacy of racism and economic insecurity in many communities in the United States, and the real challenges for just delivering drinking water safely in the infrastructure that we have. And so I'm happy to talk with you offline about it. It's a complex challenge. It has not gone away, but it does highlight, right, the way that our politics is structured. We get these flashes of interest in an issue, and it can be hard to sustain the attention that's needed to take on some of the fundamental problems that we have in managing resources and confronting common challenges.
Well, please join me in thanking Professor Mullin.